Sorry about that. We're going to get started now. Let me introduce our speakers today. Myself, Suzanne Seitz. I am a certified genetic counselor. I've been at Fairfax Cryobank for over 15 years and have been a practicing genetic counselor for over 30. For the questions at the end, we'll be joined by Cheryl Daubenberger, our Director of Client Services. If you have questions throughout this webinar, please enter them in the webinar panel and we will consolidate those and answer those in a Q&A session at the end. Let me introduce you to our genetics team as we get started here. We have many people here with a genetics background that have helped set the policies and the priorities for Fairfax Cryobank. Our medical director, Dr. Harvey Stern, is an MD PhD. His PhD is in genetics. He is a pediatric clinical geneticist. Michelle Audi, our director of operations, has a PhD in genetics. Brian Mariani, also a PhD in molecular genetics, runs our infectious disease laboratory, and he's right down the hall here and is a wonderful resource for us. And even our founder, Joseph Schulman, who, although currently retired, founded Fairfax Cryobank on the marriage of genetics with reproductive science. He is a geneticist himself, as well as being an obstetrician and gynecologist and pediatrician. So we have a very strong legacy of making genetics a priority. Let's go over the goals of the webinar. Our goals today are to go over some basics and then use that information to help us find the ideal donor. We want to go over what it means to be a carrier, explain the standard genetic testing that we perform here at Fairfax Cryobank, and then go over a step-by-step process on how we find that donor on our search using that important genetic testing information. And then obviously we'll get to your questions at the end. Let's start by taking a quick poll. How familiar are you with the expanded genetic carrier testing? There is a poll option on your web bar there. It looks like most of you consider yourselves beginners, about 3/4 of those who are listening. Well, that's wonderful because I love explaining things in great detail, and to be able to do that for 20 or 30 minutes without interruption makes me very happy. So hopefully you'll become much more familiar with this topic as we do the webinar. So expanded genetic carrier testing. It has seen some significant advancements in recent years. Back in 2018, Fairfax Cryobank started doing this expanded panel testing on all the donors, which included 283 genetic conditions. Not only have the number of conditions increased over time, the testing methodology, gene sequencing, offers the best detection rates and the best possibility of lowering risks to be a carrier. You may remember this from your biology class. Expanded panel donors are looking for recessive diseases in our sperm donors. Why does this carrier testing matter? Knowing what conditions we are carriers for before pregnancy can give us very valuable information that can help reduce the risk for our future child. For these recessive conditions, it only matters when both biological parents are carriers for the same condition or gene. Then the child is at increased risk. You'll see in this drawing that the risk is 1 in 4 or 25% for an affected child if both parents are carriers for that condition. Carriers with only one copy of the mutated gene are generally healthy and have no symptoms of the condition themselves. The normal copy of the gene compensates for the mutated one. But if a child inherits both copies of the mutated gene, one from each parent, they no longer can compensate with the normal gene as it's absent. Therefore, that child will have the disease. It's rare if you would even know that you're a carrier before you had this testing done. Most people who find out they're carriers for a condition are actually surprised. It's probably one of the most common things I hear, but I had no idea there was no family history. That is actually the pretty typical scenario. For anyone who has the expanded panel done, and we're talking about when you're having more than 200 diseases tested at one time, we find that about 70% of people will actually find themselves to be a carrier for at least one condition. You could have more than one condition. As this testing improves and more conditions are added to future panels, this will likely approach 100% soon. Remember, we have 20,000 genes that make up who we are as humans, and we can only test for a few hundred of them today on the panels that are available commercially. So we are all carriers of genetic conditions, only some of which we can test for today. The important thing is this: it only matters if the partner we have a child with is also a carrier for the same condition. This doesn't happen very often, it's very rare, but when it does, the risk is 25% for an affected child. This is the situation we're trying to avoid. So testing helps us address these questions of risk and helps us make informed choices. How do we reduce those risks? Our goal for any healthy pregnancy is to reduce risks as much as possible, and genetic testing is one of those tools to get there. If genetic testing identifies a risk, we need to make sure we understand what it means before we start a family. It can take some time to get all of our questions answered and to get to a place where we feel comfortable moving forward. So genetic testing often means being patient as we wait for results and gather information to make our decisions. If you are a carrier for a genetic condition, then the recommendation is to have the donor, in this case, tested negative. The same goes in reverse. If the donor is a carrier, you should consider testing for that condition and be negative before proceeding. Testing never gets us to 0% risk, but it can get us close. Even the best genetic testing today can't get us to a 0% risk. Let's go over the possible situations where genetic testing is an important consideration. You're a carrier based on your expanded panel results, and you're ready to look for a donor. I'll go over the process on how to look for a donor already tested negative for that same condition. If you just look at the entire list, close to 500 donors, you may get a bit overwhelmed with all the choices. You may be disappointed if the donor you like hasn't been tested yet. So we'll go over how to find a donor already tested negative and at reduced risk. And here is another possible scenario. If you are not a known carrier, it's either because you were tested with that expanded panel and found to be negative for all conditions, or because you have not had expanded panel carrier testing yet. The process of choosing a donor is a bit different. Over 300 of the donors on our list are not known carriers, and you will have many choices. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, since 2018, all new donors are tested for the expanded panel, and we fully expect 70% of them to be carriers by testing. So if you find that you like one of the donors who is already a known carrier, you will need to consider this before making a final choice. The recommendation is to have yourself tested for the at-risk condition as well. Let's go to the donor search and see how the donor's genetic testing is presented. If you click on a donor you like from the search list, it will open up to his unique donor page. The donors with the expanded panel testing look like this. There is a banner at the top with the special DNA icon. It says added bonus. This donor has expanded genetic testing. There is a Learn More link, and that includes much of the information you're learning here today. How do we see the genetic testing the donors have completed? All donors, regardless if they have had expanded panel testing or not, have a genetic testing summary available to view as a PDF download. To see what a donor has been tested for and what his results are, you can look at the genetic testing summaries located here on his donor page. It is available on all donors for sale. Donors are tested at the time they enter the program for the standard of testing that was in place at that time, so you'll see that there are donors that have varying levels of testing. Here's an example of a genetic testing summary. There are common sections that include the standard genetic testing that we do on all donors, and then there's the specific genetic disease testing section, and obviously the more recent donors have more testing done. These summaries all include a front page that gives the overview of the testing. If a donor is a known carrier, it's mentioned here and it's highlighted in red so it's not missed. And most donors will have the actual test results attached to this summary page, so you and your clinic can see all the details of his testing. Let's review what testing we do on all donors, regardless of when they started in the program. The first item on the summary will be the normal chromosome analysis, also known as a karyotype. We are looking for the normal male 46XY with no abnormalities that increase the risk in their children. All donors must have a normal chromosome analysis to even be in the program. The second test all donors have is the hemoglobin evaluation. This looks for common carrier status for diseases such as sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia. The test has been available for decades and has been part of the donor screening program since we began in the early 1980s. Now you'll see the level of additional genetic testing as well. That's on that summary sheet. We added the 283 panel recently in 2018, and you'll see all the pages that follow will list all the conditions they've been tested for. If he's a known carrier, as I mentioned before, we're going to highlight that on the front page. Other donors may have been tested for fewer conditions, but their testing is still described in detail on these summaries. Keep in mind that these reports can be quite long and complicated, so that front sheet provides a great summary and a good place to start. His actual testing results follow that front page, and the specific diseases he was tested for are there. Different labs present these results differently. It can get a little confusing. So just keep that in mind that we are trying to make a comparison by disease name. A tool we added recently to the donor search can help simplify the task of finding a donor. I'm back at the donor search page. Before you make any selections, under the basic and advanced search tabs, you'll see one called Genetic Testing Search. This is the tab you'll want to use if you need to sort through the donor list using your genetic testing results as a guide. If you open this tab, you'll see several options. So I want to explain each of them to you. The first is Any. It's our default setting. So if you don't ever open this tab, you'll see all the donors with all the genetic testing available. So that doesn't really provide any sorting yet. The next one is called Expanded Genetic Disease Tested Donors. So this will give you the donors that have been tested for those 280 plus conditions. Right now we have over 150 donors in this category, and more are being added every month. And recall that all new donors entering the program since 2018 have been tested to this standard. So this is the group of donors whose numbers are going to continue to increase over time. If you select Expanded Panel Donors All Negative, you'll see donors who are not carriers by this testing method. As I mentioned earlier, only about 30% of people who have expanded panel testing done are actually negative for all the conditions for which they were tested. And this is the case with our donors as well. This is a good option for those who have not had any carrier testing done themselves, but the choice of donors will be fewer. If you plan on having carrier testing or are waiting for results to come back, you'll be able to consider a larger group of donors when your results are completed. So you can look at this list first, but consider the other donors when your expanded testing results are completed. Using the select options is for those who already know they are a carrier for genetic disease. You can sort by disease name or gene. When looking at your results, you will need to know the name of the disease and gene name for that disease. I include some examples here. Tay-Sachs disease has gene name HEXA, Cystic fibrosis is CFTR. I include phenylalanine hydroxylase deficiency, PAH, because that's often called by a different disease name, phenylketonuria or PKU. So the common denominator is that gene name, PAH. The other thing that's important to remember is that there are subtypes for different diseases, like you could have a type 1 or a type 2B. The Zellweger spectrum syndrome, PEX6, is actually only one of many Zellweger spectrum syndrome conditions. There's a PEX1, a PEX2, a PEX10. They're ultimately all different diseases because they are on different genes, even though the disease name is similar. Here's another example of something that might confuse a bit. Sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia are two diseases that occur in mutations on the same gene, HBB. And when you are looking for those conditions, you might have to use one of these different names to find them, or the common denominator, HBB, is a good one to use. We want to make sure that you don't have a disease gene anywhere in HBB. So let's go over how you do the search by disease name. You search for the disease name. There's a search box. You can type it in, or you can find it in the alphabetical listing. You check the box or boxes if you're a carrier for more than one condition, and you hit apply. You'll note here that the gene name is actually following the name of the disease. So this is a good place for you to cross-reference that the disease name and the gene name are the same. This is a search by gene name. All genes are listed in alphabetical order, and here you'll not see the disease name. Find the genes you need to select for, check the box or boxes, and hit apply. You only need to use one search or the other, not both. Now that you've applied the genes or diseases that matter to you, you can make the list even more customized to suit your wish list. If you enter in other characteristics that matter to you before you hit the search button at the bottom, your list will have more of the donors you will like. This will give you a list that is much closer to what you wanted in the first place, just with your genetic testing considerations added into the process. You can add these selection criteria in whatever order you prefer, doing these traits first and then adding the genetic information, or starting with genetics and then adding the traits that matter to you. Just get them all in, entered before you hit the search button at the bottom. You can also try the search in different ways to see if you can change the number of donors on your search results. If there are too many donors to consider, add more traits that matter to you. If there are too few, take one or two traits off the list to make the list larger. It's possible that after looking at the donors on your search results, you'll find a donor who's a carrier for a different condition than you're a carrier for. He'll be negative for the one that you entered, but he may be positive for something else. So it's important to check that you have been tested negative for the disease he is a carrier for. Many clinics will want you to do this before you ship vials to their clinic. So it's a good idea to check in with them to understand their policies. Everyone is invested in making sure that any identified risk is reduced as much as possible. If you haven't been tested, then you'll need to consider testing before choosing this donor. Or you can keep looking until you find a donor that is more genetically compatible. Now let's consider the reverse. If you find a donor you like, but he has not been tested yet for the condition you are a carrier for, there are options. You can request that he undergoes special testing for that condition. Not all donors can be tested, but most can. We also need to verify that the condition you want tested is one we will test for. Some adult onset conditions with effective treatment or conditions that often show no symptoms are excluded from further testing. It also has to be a serious pediatric condition that is inherited from 2 carrier parents. Recall the recessive disease slide earlier. 2 carrier parents have a 25% risk of an affected child. We also only test for conditions that your future pregnancy is at risk for, so only the conditions that you are positive for on your carrier screening. Results take about 4 weeks, and there is a fee involved. In addition, you need to own at least 1 vial before we get started to avoid having the donor sell out while we wait for results. If you are flexible on donor choice, it is always worthwhile to look for donors who are already tested negative before pursuing the special testing option. If you're ready to order a donor and he is a known carrier, you'll see this on his donor page. Under his genetic testing results, you'll see an acknowledgement of genetic risk. Before purchasing and shipping any vials of donors who are carriers, you'll need to have this completed. It can be done online as a DocuSign, which is very easy and quick, or it can be downloaded as a PDF signed and returned to us. Let me go over what's involved. So if you open an acknowledgement of genetic risk, these are the parts of that agreement. It has a donor number. It says what he's a carrier for with the disease name and the gene name. There's a request that you discuss these results with your healthcare provider. The bolded statement there says that when both biological parents are carriers for the same disease, there is an increased risk for their children to have that disease. A recommendation that you seek genetic counseling and any recommended genetic testing before selecting this donor. Most testing companies that do the expanded genetic disease screening offer free genetic counseling when your results are completed. And there's a section on our refund policy. You can choose this donor now, and you can still have time to seek your own genetic testing if needed. You have 45 days to complete your own testing, which usually only takes about 3 weeks. Testing may be available by saliva kit and can be mailed to your home. So even in these times of stay-at-home orders, it is likely you can still move forward. If it turns out that you're positive for the same condition as the sperm donor, it's very unlikely, but if that is the case, you can't use that donor. You will be offered a full refund for those vials. You can take the refund, or you can simply exchange those donor vials for another donor. If there is a higher price, you will be asked to pay the difference. The bottom there's a name, address, date of birth, signature area, and then it only takes a few minutes, as I said, to do this online. Let's review all the steps to find what it takes to make a compatible match. If you are a carrier, the donor has been tested negative, this match is low risk and compatible. And in reverse, if the donor is a carrier and you have been tested negative, good match. And finally, if neither you or the donor are known carriers, the match is considered compatible. When you're ready to order vials, you can either do the process online or call client services. We recommend that if it's your first time ordering vials from Fairfax Cryobank, that you do call us so that we can walk through the process together. There's a terms of use that will need to be completed before that first order. You can find that link to that form on our resource tab from the home page. It's a DocuSign form as well. It should be reviewed completely before signing. It tells you what you can expect from us and what we can expect from you. So reading it thoroughly is very important. Once we have the terms of use completed, you don't need to do it again for any future orders. The other option is to do the whole process online. You'll need to know your healthcare provider name and address. You can choose to ship to arrive on a specific day or have us store the vials for you until you need them. If you do need a quick turnaround time, it's best to call us so that we can go over the details with you so we can get that shipment out as quickly as possible. And remember, if you're waiting for your testing results to be completed, you will not want to ship those vials until after those results come back negative, just to make sure. So let's wrap up. Here are the main takeaways. Being a carrier is normal and a natural part of being a human being. What matters is that if one of us is a carrier, the other biological parent be tested negative for that condition in order for the risks to be reduced for your child. This applies if we are carriers, or if the donor is a carrier, or if both of us are carriers, as long as it is not for the same disease. The donor search has tools that allow us to sort based on genetic testing results, and this allows us to find a compatible match. And when we find the ideal donor, we can now move forward and complete our order. Let's take the poll again. Let's see if you guys feel a little more educated about this. I'm getting some results in. Oh, awesome. I would say most of you have moved up a level. That's great. I consider myself a good teacher, I guess. That's wonderful. Well, these really are the basics of the things that you need to be able to move forward. Even if you're just embarking on having the genetic testing yourself, or really want to understand what all these genetic testing results mean on these individual donors, this is a really good primer to get you started so that it's not quite as confusing. We are going to open it up at this point for Q&A. We do have a promo code that's available for all of our attendees today who wish to take advantage of it, Genetics Webinar. It's for a free unlimited access plan, which would last for 3 months. You can put it in between now and May 31st, and you would get the free unlimited access plan. That includes the adult photos if you're interested in seeing those on select donors. Also wanted you to be aware of how to contact us. You can chat from fairfaxcryobank.com homepage, or you can call us at the 1-800 number listed there, 1-800-338-8407. And we are open Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And Saturdays from, 11:30 to 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. I see a typo there. So if you have questions, why don't you go ahead and put those in, and we will get started.
So we do have some good questions coming in. We have one question here that says, is there a list of what tests were taken? For Suzanne here.
Every donor is going to have that specific list of genetic diseases on his genetic testing summary. But if you'd like to see what we currently test for, that's the Semaphore 283 test. We do have a link to that on our genetics expanded panel genetics page online, and it goes directly to the Semaphore website that lists each disease that they test for on that panel. So yes, it is available online.
Okay, another person wants to know, do they need to request this panel from their doctor?
It's easier if both the donor and the person using that donor have the same panel done. It allows us to compare apples to apples. Not every panel has exactly the same list of diseases as the other panel does. So we don't want that one rogue disease to be positive. So it's ideal if it's the Semaphore panel. You need to talk to your clinic and your doctor. They may already have arrangements with a different laboratory for this kind of testing. But certainly if you can ask for the Semaphore test, that's preferable to us. We vetted a lot of companies before we chose Semaphore, and we have been exceptionally pleased with the quality of their work. Their staff of genetic counselors and geneticists are amazing. So we considered it an amazing test. So hopefully that's the one your doctor will be able to do for you.
Another person wants to know when they can hear the recorded session of this webinar. It will be emailed out to everyone who attended and registered, even if they weren't able to join for the full time. So that will be coming to your inbox later today. Another question for Suzanne is, what was the search option to find negative genes?
So you go to the genetic testing search tab, and you then have all of those options, and there's one that says all negative, genetic disease testing all negative. So if you hit that button and hit search, then you'll see all the donors that are negative. And keep in mind, that'll only be about 30% of the new donors that we've added to the site since 2018. So that number is not going to be as large. And if you're looking for a donor with very specific characteristics, it might be harder to find one in that group, but it has over 50 donors at this point.
Here's another question for Suzanne. If the mother is not a carrier for any conditions, but the donor is, what is the percentage chance that the child will have that condition?
So, okay, so the donor's a carrier, mom has not been tested yet. So it depends on the disease. You know,
the mother's not a carrier, but the donor is.
Yeah, donor is a carrier, mother
is not.
Is not. So our risk to be a carrier depends on the disease. Diseases like cystic fibrosis, we have a 1 in 25 chance of being a carrier. But there are other diseases that are exceptionally rare, and we may only have a 1 in 500 chance. So it depends on the disease. And once we know what the disease is and what the individual carrier risk is, we can calculate the risk. This is what we do as genetic counselors. We calculate the risk to the child. So we know it's 25% of carrier parents have affected children. So we would multiply the mom's risk of being a carrier times 1 in 4 and come up with the risk for the child. Now that number might still be quite low, but it is an identified risk, and it's obviously something you want to consider as to whether or not you want to be tested. But the risk matters, I understand that.
Does Fairfax Cryobank offer genetic testing kits for purchase?
We can facilitate working with your clinic. Your clinic has to order it ultimately. It has to be ordered by your physician since those results are coming back to you. We can help you get the semaphore set up through your doctor's office, yes.
And then a similar, for donors without the expanded panel testing, is it possible to add the genetic test?
So we will test donors without the expanded panel testing for conditions that your pregnancy is at risk for. So if you have had the expanded panel done and you're positive for 1 or 2 conditions, we will do special testing on the donor for those at-risk conditions. You have to remember, if you've already tested negative for all those other conditions on the panel, the results on the donor are not critical to you because you're already negative. So we will only test for the conditions for which the pregnancy is at risk.
This question's more for client services. Cheryl, I'd like to place an order, but my doctor's office isn't open yet. What would happen to the vials if I ordered them now?
Oh, sure. That's actually a great question. So if you are ready to place the order and you want to ensure the availability of your donor, even though your clinic is closed, we're still able to store that or store those semen samples here at Fairfax Cryobank. And currently, we're also offering 6 months of free storage. So that way, hopefully the clinic then has time to open back up and you then wouldn't owe anything for storage as long as that vial or vials shipped out prior, excuse me, prior to the end of that 6-month term.
Okay. Here's another question about, are things like personality inherited?
Well, that's a loaded question. You know, one of the reasons we put the personality information up on the donors, they've taken a personality test, is for you to see what his personality is like, introverted, extroverted. This is the nature-nurture question. How much of this is the environment that we grow up in versus the genetics that we inherit? I think that's a tough one to answer. Very tough. I don't think there's a definitive answer. Clearly, there's some part of our nervous system that we inherit, but how much of that actually shows up as personality, it's unclear.
And then someone here says, what if I was looking at your website and I couldn't find the right match? What other options available to help?
You know, we really do want to walk this step-by-step process with you. The client services folks are great at getting at the initial desires that you have for what you want in a donor. I can certainly come in if the genetic testing is a factor, but they are very good at all the nuances of how that donor search works. There are a lot of choices. So we can certainly help you figure out a way to get that list a little bit larger, and make sure there's somebody there that you like. And then of course, we're always adding new donors every month, so you can always check back. You know, people take a long time to choose a donor. It can take 5, 6, 7 weeks before you come to a final decision for some people. So during that time, you'll often see many new donors entering the program. So you can pay attention and see if there's somebody new that enters the list, and see if that one might be the right choice for you.
So would you recommend that new clients get the genetic testing up front so that we don't waste time when we're ready to purchase vials?
Well, I mean, it is your choice whether or not you want expanded panel testing done. Nobody can tell you you have to do it. It's going to give you information that you have to understand. If you're a carrier, it also means that was inherited from one of your parents, and so your parents and your siblings are going to be impacted by that information as well. So that's a choice an informed choice that you can make. But if you are looking at the donors with the expanded panel, and you find a donor who's a carrier, then doing the expanded panel is going to be recommended. You can always hold that donor, buy vials of that donor, keep him in reserve, and then do your expanded panel testing. It's going to be very unlikely you're carriers for the same condition, so you likely can move forward. But if you've done the expanded panel first, it does allow you to walk through this fairly quickly once you know what you want. So it really is up to you.
Another question we have here is, when selecting a donor, how long should we take for this process? I don't know if I'm overthinking or rushing this process.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we did a survey of clients at one point, and the average amount of time it took to make a final decision was between 5 and 7 weeks. So this is not something typically that people do in a weekend or even just on a Friday night. Each donor has so much information, just reading through it, listening to the audio takes a tremendous amount of time. And so, you know, it's nice to be able to use the genetic testing feature to get the list down to a manageable number so that you can at least start with a more targeted list. But you aren't overthinking it. It does take a long time, and you're looking for more than just that pragmatic genetic match on testing. You want someone who's likable, who really fits in with your family. So it's an emotional decision as well as a practical one. So it does take some time to get there.
And then if you have a donor that you are interested in, but they are out of vials, how do we know when they'll be back and made available again?
Cheryl?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best option is to call and speak with client services directly. Some donors can have already retired from the donation program, which you're not able to see directly online, whereas others, it may be a wait list or we're just waiting for additional samples to become available. So if you contact client services directly, we can at least look into this a bit more for you, so that way we can give you the information. We prefer to have you with all of the information to best be able to make a decision that's good for you and your family. But again, it's really gonna be best to speak directly with us over the phone or through our chat service, which is available right on the homepage of our website.
And we do have a couple questions regarding coronavirus. Two here. One is saying, is the donor tested for COVID-19? And someone else wants to know, is there a chance that the donor has coronavirus?
Well, you know, we are following very closely the guidelines of American Society of Reproductive Medicine on what is involved with donor gamete programs and COVID. So we are certainly getting educated. You know, our sites at this point are being very cautious, and so any donors that currently have vials that have released were collected more than 6 months ago. So any donors that are on the site today clearly were not created during a high-risk time. but we are certainly following the developments very closely, and we'll keep you all informed as well. We're likely going to put those policy statements online.
Someone wants to know if we have genetic counselors available for customers to review our results.
So I'm the genetic counselor here, and I certainly want to help. I am available. If you have a genetic testing result that you've received and you've already gotten yourself informed about what it means for you, and the next step is to look at compatible donors, that's where I can step in and be very helpful, especially if you have your results available, you know which donors you're interested in, then I can make a very quick assessment. I call it my suitability match, and I can take a look and see that whatever you're positive for, he's tested negative for, and vice versa, and kind of give it the green light so that you know moving to the next step of purchasing the vials makes sense. I'm happy to do that.
Some people have some questions about what is CMV. Is this a new thing?
So CMV stands for cytomegalovirus. That is an infectious disease. It's a flu-like disease. This has nothing really to do with genetics at all. So it's not inherited. But if the donor has been exposed to CMV at some point in his life, he's developed antibodies. And if he has antibodies, he's considered CMV positive. That does not indicate that he's infectious. It simply means that he had a past exposure, developed antibodies, and those can now be detected in his blood. If you are CMV negative, which means you have not been exposed or developed antibodies to CMV, clinics will often recommend that you consider using a CMV negative donor as well. The majority of people in the general population are CMV positive, so that will limit your choice of donors. But again, that I would refer you back to your clinic because your results dictate how you choose a donor. If you are CMV negative, you may find your clinic recommending only CMV negative donors. If you are CMV positive, any donor on the list will work, CMV positive or negative.
If the donor is clear of all genetic risks, should the person receiving the donor sperm still be tested?
So if the donor if he's one of the donors that's been all negative for an expanded panel, then the person using that donor does not have to be screened. That's right. There's no indication for screening at that point. That's very true. If he had a small panel that was done a few years back, it may still be an option worth considering, knowing that we may have to go back and ping pong back and forth a bit till we make sure everybody's tested negative. But if the original question was, if the donor is all negative for 283 plus, the recipient of that donor does not need to be screened.
Someone here wants to know about the 23andMe website and their services. Is that a good option for them for getting?
23andMe is really not at the level of testing that the semaphore testing is. They often do not use the gene sequencing, so they're just looking for some known variants or mutations within the gene. Their detection rate is pretty low. The number of diseases they test are pretty small. I would feel more reassured with the better test, with the higher detection rate, with the better testing methodology. So I know a lot of people are ordering it because they get lots of other information from the 23andMe, ethnicity or relatedness to people. So I understand that that can be interesting, and you could just click another box for this additional panel, but that's not the type of testing that your doctor would be ordering for you or that we would recommend you have done.
Okay, here's someone who says that my donor is found positive for Alstrom, and I did genetic testing, but Alstrom was not part of the test. How do you know where I can get that specific test done or how I can order it?
We would have to go back to your clinic. You know, your clinic has a relationship with the genetic testing lab. That genetic testing lab that's been providing results to your doctor's office for quite some time is going to be the resource for getting that additional testing done. I can help find a lab that will do the testing, but ultimately it might just be a matter of the clinician contacting the lab where you did have the testing done to see if perhaps there is a one-off test that can be ordered through that same facility. If not, then I can certainly give recommendations for other labs that do the testing.
Another question here for Cheryl about the wait list is, someone wants to know, I guess this is sort of similar, but if the donor's on a waiting list, how long do I need to wait? Would it be possible for you guys to say an approximate when the sperms would be available for a specific donor?
So at this point, the answer unfortunately is no. We don't have specific dates that those would be released, since it is so very dependent on the donor and his personal schedule, trying to be able to visit our actual office. So we do constantly follow up with the donors just to visit again, leave additional donations, as well as for blood work to be able to clear samples from a quarantine status. But again, things in general can come up during the time, so it's really not something that I'm able to provide any type of idea of when the actual samples are going to become available from a wait list, because there's really no way for us to predetermine when that potentially could release.
Okay, here's another question, both for Cheryl, I guess, and Suzanne. How many vials would you recommend purchasing for first-time moms, and if you wanted to use the same donor for future children?
Cheryl?
Sure. So yeah, this is actually one of my very general, very unscientific, but over my 14 years of history, I've come up with this calculation to at least give an idea, because our semen samples are all sold first come, first serve. So we don't hold back or reserve vials for sibling pregnancies in the future. So if you have found your donor and you don't want to use a separate donor to be able to complete your family, obviously you want to take into account the cost overall, because it's not the cheapest type of process. But what I always suggest is starting with your clinic. Let's find out from your clinic in general how many semen samples they want to use per procedure. The average is between 1 and 2 samples per procedure. So we'll say that you need 2 samples per procedure, and on average, it's about 3 months before you'll see some type of success. So for 1 child, I'd say you'd probably want 6 samples to be safe. 2 children would be 12 samples. So it's 2 vials per procedure for each of those months over the 3-month period per child. So again, depending upon what type of funds are available to be able to invest in this, and how many vials the clinic is going to recommend per procedure, I kind of use that very, again, unscientific type of guesstimation. So that way you can be as prepared as possible. And one thing that I like to mention as well is with our storage program, as long as your semen samples never leave our facility, we will always buy those back from you for 50% of the original purchase price. So knowing that I'm that type A person, I would much rather put all of that money up front to know that I'm guaranteed those vials that I've purchased and are secured under my storage account. But it's also great to know that you can at least recoup some of those funds if you've finished completing your family and you no longer need to use the additional samples left. So again, lots of different things to consider during that time, but overall, that's the best guesstimation that I'm able to provide, unless Suzanne has some other insights or thoughts about that.
No, I think there is some scientific data that says, the average chance of conception with artificial insemination runs about 15 to 18% per cycle, but that's very dependent on a woman's own fertility and ovarian reserve. So even in natural conception, without using insemination, it's only about 20% per cycle in a fertile couple. So it is important to remember we don't really get beyond that possibility.
Here's another question again regarding CMV. Someone wants to know, should I be comparing CMV status for her egg donor in vials or the egg carrier in vials?
Carrier, the person who's carrying the pregnancy.
Okay, and then doesn't a female patient still need Fragile X carrier screening if chosen donor is negative for all conditions on semaphore?
There are, women do have a list of recommended X-linked disorders that they can be tested for. Our donors, if our donor is all negative, then you don't need to have any of those conditions that he was tested for done. But there is a separate recommendation for all women of reproductive age to have X-linked conditions tested, including Fragile X. That would typically show a positive family history through the mom's side of the family for mental retardation in boys. But yes, there is a recommendation. I mean, I was, I guess, answering the question specifically for what the diseases the egg donor was tested, the sperm donor was tested for.
Okay, let's see. Someone wants to know about the hours to call in and how to get in touch with customer service.
So that's on that last slide there. So the hours are Monday through Friday, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The Saturday, there's a typo there. It's 11:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Okay, another one here talking about what type of vials should be selected if I'm using an egg and a sperm donor.
You know, that's your clinic preference. They may have a preference, or they may say any vial will do, but it is really your clinic that dictates what kind of vial specimen is acceptable for them.
So there are a lot of questions on here. I think we'll maybe take one more. Someone wants to know, my mom had ovarian cancer, but I'm not a carrier for the gene. The donor I want, their mom died from ovarian cancer. Would my child be at risk?
You know, we don't test for adult onset cancer genes, so we can't give you an absolute answer on that. So certainly given your family history, that's another tool you can use, is screening out medical histories that are negative for any type of cancer that's related to what may be running in your family. So we can't obviously reassure you to the point of no risk in that situation. All right, so we are going to go ahead and wrap this up, but we are going to put together a blog post addressing several of the other questions that we weren't able to get to, and I look forward to writing up some of those answers for you. And again, this recording will be sent out to everybody that participated today, and you're certainly welcome to get in touch with us if you have any additional questions. Thank you very much.